Der 17. Januar 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. The morning air hung thick with fog and the acrid stench of cordite. Snow fell in lazy spirals through skeletal trees, their blackened trunks standing like grave markers over frozen earth. In a hastily dug artillery position 3 kilometers behind the front line, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Reinhardt pressed his eye to the rangefinder, his breath visible in the pre-dawn cold. Around him, the crew of the 105mm Lee FH-18 howitzer worked with mechanical precision, their movements honed by years of war. They had trained for this. They had perfected this. And in the mathematics of artillery warfare, they had once been masters. Reinhardt had joined the Wehrmacht Artillery Corps in 1937, when German gunnery doctrine represented the pinnacle of European military science. He had been taught by men who had themselves learned their trade in the Great War, veterans who understood that artillery was not merely about throwing shells at an enemy, but about controlling time and space. The German system was elegant in its brutality. Forward observers would spot enemy positions, coordinates would be calculated with Teutonic precision, and shells would arc through the sky in predetermined trajectories. The enemy, if they were wise, would take cover the moment they heard the guns fire. Between the flash of the muzzle and the arrival of the shell, there existed a window, sometimes 15 seconds, sometimes 30, in which infantry could dive into foxholes, scatter from supply routes, or abandon exposed positions. This window had been the fundamental constant of artillery warfare since the invention of the cannon. It was physics. It was predictable. It was survivable if you were quick and disciplined. But on this grey January morning, as Reinhardt watched American positions through his optics, he noticed something that troubled him. The enemy infantry were not moving with the desperate urgency he had come to expect. They walked between their positions almost casually. Supply trucks moved along roads that should have been death traps. When his battery fired ranging shots, the Americans would take cover. Yes, but without the panic that came from knowing you had only seconds to live. "They've grown comfortable," muttered Gefreiter Hans Vogel, the gun's loader, as he hefted another shell into the breach. "The Amis think their numbers make them invincible." Reinhardt had heard this sentiment often in the ranks. There was a certain contempt among German artillerists for the Americans, a contempt born not of hatred but of professional disdain. The Americans were wealthy. They had unlimited shells, unlimited guns, unlimited everything. But wealth was not skill. Abundance was not precision. The German crews, even in their depleted state, even with their aging equipment and shrinking ammunition reserves, still believed in the superiority of their craft. "Let them be comfortable," Reinhardt replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too many winters. "The grave is comfortable too." He could not have known, as he spoke those words, that the very physics of his profession were about to be rewritten. The German artillery tradition stretched back through centuries of European warfare. Frederick the Great had revolutionized mobile artillery in the 18th century. Krupp had given the Kaiser's armies the most advanced guns in the world during the Great War. By the time the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland, German artillery doctrine combined centuries of accumulated wisdom. Massed fires, precise calculations, and the understanding that artillery was the queen of battle, more reliable than tanks, more devastating than aircraft, the constant presence that ground enemy forces into dust. Reinhardt had been 21 when he first fired a gun in anger, during the invasion of France in 1940. He still remembered the euphoria of those days, the sense that German arms were invincible. His battery had participated in the reduction of French fortifications along the Meuse. They had fired over open sights at Belgian pillboxes. The mathematics had always worked. Calculate the range, adjust for wind and elevation, fire, observe, adjust, fire again. The enemy learned to fear the whistle of incoming shells, but they also learned to exploit that precious window between sound and impact. This was the covenant of artillery warfare. "I will announce my presence with thunder, and you will have your chance to hide." By 1943, Reinhardt had become a sergeant, his battery transferred to the Eastern Front. There, he learned new lessons. The Soviets had artillery in quantities that defied comprehension, thousands of guns concentrated in single sectors, turning German positions into moonscapes of cratered earth. Yet even Soviet gunnery operated under the same fundamental rules. You heard the guns, you counted the seconds. You lived or you died based on your discipline and your luck. The Americans, when Reinhardt first encountered them in Normandy, had seemed almost naive in comparison. They had firepower. Certainly their 155mm long toms could outrange German guns, and their forward observer teams called in strikes with impressive efficiency. But there was something wasteful about American artillery doctrine, something that offended Reinhardt's sense of professional economy. They would fire 10 shells, where a German crew would fire 3. They relied on overwhelming volume rather than surgical precision. They fight like millionaires, Vogel had observed after their battery retreated from Mortain, having lost 2 guns to American counter-battery fire. Spending shells like a rich man spends coins, Reinhardt had agreed. And in that agreement lived a seed of contempt, a quiet professional superiority that sustained German gunners even as their army crumbled around them. The Americans might have more of everything, but they lacked the craftsmanship, the artistry of true gunnery. They were hammer-wielders in a profession that required the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. This belief, this professional pride was about to encounter a reality that would shatter it as completely as high explosives shattered flesh. The proximity fuse, designated VT for variable time, had been among the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied war effort. Its development had involved researchers at Johns Hopkins University, scientists at the Carnegie Institution, and engineers from dozens of American corporations. The principle was revolutionary. Instead of requiring a shell to physically strike its target or rely on a timed fuse to detonate at a predetermined altitude, the VT fuse used a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the nose of the shell itself. As the shell descended toward Earth, the radio waves it emitted would reflect off the ground or any solid object below. When the reflected signal reached a critical strength, indicating the shell was at optimal burst height, typically 20 to 30 feet above the ground, the fuse would trigger detonation. The result was an airburst that sent shrapnel screaming downward in a lethal cone, catching anyone within its radius, regardless of whether they were prone, in a shallow foxhole, or crouching behind cover. The technology required miniaturization that pushed the boundaries of 1,940 seconds electronics. The entire radio system had to fit inside a shell casing, withstand the massive acceleration forces of being fired from a cannon forces that could exceed 20,000 times gravity and then function perfectly during its brief flight. Early prototypes had failed catastrophically. Vacuum tubes would shatter, circuits would short, batteries would rupture. But American industry had solved these problems with characteristic persistence and unlimited resources. By late 1944, production of VT-fused shells had reached industrial scale. The fuses were expensive, each one cost approximately $25, at a time when an entire artillery shell might cost $3. But America could afford expensive. America could afford anything. The fuses were first used extensively in the Pacific Theater, where they proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft. But their true transformative impact came when they were deployed against ground targets in the European theater. The first large-scale use came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when American artillery, equipped with VT fuses, helped blunt the German offensive. For the soldiers on the receiving end, the experience was existentially terrifying in a way that conventional artillery was not. There was no window. There was no time to react. The shells burst overhead before you heard the guns, before you saw the flash, before you had any warning at all. The mathematics of survival, calculate distance, count seconds, dive for cover, became meaningless. You could be in a foxhole, behind a wall, in a trench, and still the shrapnel would find you from above. It was as if the sky itself had become malevolent. Reinhardt first encountered proximity-fused artillery on the 12th of January 1945, 5 days before that grey morning in the Hurtgen forest. His battery had been repositioning along a forest trail, moving their guns under cover of darkness to avoid American aerial observation. They had just reached their new position when the first shells arrived. He remembered hearing the distant thump of guns, American 105mm howitzers by the sound, perhaps 4 kilometers away. Standard procedure. His men would take cover for approximately 15 seconds, then resume their work. The shells were not even aimed at them directly. They seemed targeted at a crossroads half a kilometer distant, but then the sky erupted. The shells detonated in the air, perfect airbursts that turned the forest canopy into a storm of steel fragments. Men who had been standing died before they could react. Men in foxholes died in their holes. Reinhardt himself survived only because he had been inside the cabin of a half-track, its thin armor enough to deflect the shrapnel that killed 3 of his crew members standing beside it. The barrage lasted 2 minutes. When it ended, 7 of his men were dead or dying, 2 guns were damaged beyond field repair, and the survivors huddled in genuine terror, a word Reinhardt had rarely used to describe his veterans. "They didn't even aim at us," Vogel said, his voice shaking as he helped load wounded onto a truck. "Those shells weren't for us. We were just nearby." Reinhardt had no response. In his mind, he was trying to reconcile what he had experienced with everything he knew about artillery warfare. The Americans had not adjusted their fire. There had been no ranging shots, no walking barrage toward their position. The shells had simply burst in the air, scything down everything beneath them with mechanical indifference. That night, as his diminished battery dug into new positions, Reinhardt spoke with an Oberleutnant from a neighboring unit. The officer had been in the Ardennes during the initial American counterattacks in December. "It's a new Fuze," the lieutenant said, his face haggard in the firelight. "We don't know how it works. Some say it's triggered by radio signals. Others claim it senses heat or metal. What we do know is that there's no defense against it. When those shells come in, you pray. That's all you can do." "How many guns do they have with these fuses?" Reinhardt asked. The lieutenant laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "How many guns do the Americans have?" "They all have it, Reinhardt. Every battery, every caliber. We captured some of the shells near Bastogne. Our technical officers examined them. Do you know what they concluded? That it would take Germany's entire electronics industry 5 years to produce what the Americans mount in a single shell. And they're using thousands of these shells every day. Reinhardt thought of his own battery's ammunition supply. 47 rounds remaining, with no resupply expected for at least a week. The Americans were using technology that Germany could not hope to replicate, and they were using it with the careless abundance of a nation that had never known true shortage. "What did we expect?" Vogel said quietly after the lieutenant had left. "We're fighting a country that has cars for every family. Of course they can build miracle fuses. But it was more than abundance," Reinhardt understood. It was the marriage of abundance with innovation, resources, wedded to scientific ingenuity. Germany had possessed brilliant scientists, had pioneered rocketry, jet engines, infrared optics, but all of that genius had been strangled by dwindling resources and strategic desperation. The Americans had taken a different path. Unlimited resources channeled through systematic research, industrial-scale production of advanced technology. They had turned quality into quantity, and quantity into inevitability. The Wehrmacht had been built on principles of qualitative superiority. From its inception, German military doctrine had emphasized training, discipline, and technological edge to offset numerical disadvantages. A single German soldier was supposed to be worth 3 Soviet conscripts. A Tiger tank was supposed to counter 5 Shermans. This arithmetic of quality had sustained German forces through years of warfare against numerically superior enemies, but the proximity fuse represented something German doctrine had not accounted for. A technology so advanced that it negated tactical skill, and so abundant that it could be used wastefully. In traditional artillery duels, German crews had advantages. Their rangefinders were often superior, their forward observers were better trained. Their doctrine emphasized economy of force, achieving maximum effect with minimum expenditure. A skilled German battery commander could suppress an enemy position with a dozen well-placed rounds where an American might use 50. But when every American shell burst at optimal height, When every round became a precision weapon regardless of where it landed, those advantages evaporated. American gunners didn't need to be precise. They just needed to fire in the general direction of German positions, and the Fuzes would do the rest. Reinhardt saw this calculus play out in terrible clarity on January 17th. His battery had been tasked with suppressing an American infantry advance along a forest road. The coordinates were good, the weather was clear, and his crews were among the best remaining in the division. They fired a careful barrage, 18 shells, precisely aimed, each one calculated to land among the American assembly areas. Through his optics, Reinhardt watched the shells impact. Good hits. The Americans scattered and took cover, their advance halted. A successful mission by any traditional metric. Then the American reply came. He heard the distant rumble of counter-battery fire, not from one American battery, but from what sounded like an entire battalion. The sky above his position began to blossom with airbursts, a steel garden of death that materialized faster than thought. Reinhardt screamed for his men to take cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The airbursts filled the forest with horizontal shrapnel streams that cut through trees, earth, and flesh with equal ease. The barrage lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Reinhardt's battery had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Both guns were destroyed, their barrels twisted by direct hits. 19 men were dead. 8 more were wounded badly enough to require immediate evacuation. Of the crew that had awakened that morning, only Reinhardt and 5 others remained combat effective. He sat in the cratered earth, his ears ringing, and tried to comprehend the disproportion of the exchange. His battery had fired 18 shells in a carefully aimed barrage. The Americans had responded with what he estimated to be 200 shells, each one a precision instrument, fired with the casual abundance of men who knew their factories would replace every expended round before nightfall. "We can't fight this," Vogel said beside him, his face grey with shock and realization. "They don't need to be better than us, they just need to have more." But it was deeper than numbers, Reinhardt knew. The proximity fuse represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. For centuries, battles had been contests of skill, mediated by technology. The better trained force, the more disciplined army, the superior tactical mind, these could triumph over numerical disadvantage. But here was a technology so advanced and so abundant that it simply erased the battlefield equation. There was no tactical response to a shell that detonated before you knew it was coming. There was no defensive position that could protect against shrapnel that arrived from directly overhead. The Americans had done something that no army in history had accomplished. They had made overwhelming force into a science, and then produced it industrially. In the German ranks, among the survivors of encounters with proximity-fused artillery, a new kind of shell shock emerged. It was not the hysteria of the Great War, not the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much combat. It was something colder. The psychological impact of understanding that you were fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy whose advantages were not merely numerical, but existential. The German soldier had been conditioned to accept hardship. He could endure cold, hunger, and exhaustion. He could face superior numbers if he believed his training and equipment gave him a fighting chance. But the proximity fuse stripped away that psychological foundation. It didn't matter how well you were trained. It didn't matter how disciplined your unit was. When the American shells came, you lived or died according to pure chance, and the statistical probability tilted overwhelmingly toward death. Reinhardt watched this realization spread through the survivors of his battery. These were men who had fought on 3 fronts, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk and Normandy. They were not easily frightened, but in their eyes, he saw something new. The understanding that they were primitives fighting against a civilization so technologically advanced that their own skills and courage were rendered meaningless. "My father fought in the Great War," Vogel said one night as they huddled in a frozen dugout, waiting for transport to a rear area replacement depot. "He told me about the artillery barrages, days-long bombardments that turned the earth into hell. But he said you could survive if you were smart, if you stayed low and kept your nerve. There were rules. This," he gestured vaguely at the night sky, There are no rules anymore. Reinhardt thought of his own education in artillery science, the years of study and practice that had made him a master of his craft. All of that knowledge had been rendered obsolete by American engineers working in laboratories he could barely imagine, building technologies his country couldn't hope to replicate. It was not merely a defeat of arms, it was a defeat of civilization itself. He had laughed in the early days. They all had. Laughed at American wastefulness, at their clumsy tactics, at their reliance on material superiority over martial skill. That laughter seemed now like the prideful blindness of men who didn't understand they were already obsolete. The proximity fuse was not just a weapon. It was a symbol, a tiny radio transmitter that contained within its circuits the entire vast gulf between Germany and America. One nation was scraping the bottom of its resource barrel, cannibalizing its own industrial base to feed a war machine that grew weaker each day. The other was producing miracles as standard issue, giving every artillery shell the kind of sophisticated guidance system that Germany couldn't mass-produce for its most advanced rockets. The technology itself told a story about two different kinds of civilization. The German war effort had been characterized by brilliant individual innovations, jet fighters, ballistic missiles, advanced optics, but always in limited numbers, always constrained by shortages of rare materials and skilled labor. Germany's scientists were as talented as any in the world, but they worked within an economy increasingly strangled by blockade, bombing, and the simple mathematics of total war against numerically superior enemies. The proximity fuse required a different approach: systematic research, massive investment, and the marriage of academic science with industrial production. It needed vacuum tube manufacturers to miniaturize their products. It needed battery makers to develop power sources that could survive gun launches. It needed radio engineers to design circuits simple enough to mass produce, yet sophisticated enough to distinguish ground from air. And it needed an industrial base capable of producing all of this at scale, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and conventional ammunition. The Americans had built an entire industrial ecosystem just to manufacture artillery fuses. Factories in dozens of states produced components. Assembly lines staffed by workers who had been farmers and shopkeepers 3 years earlier put together electronic devices more complex than most radios. Quality control systems tested each fuse to ensure it would survive the violence of being fired from a gun. And all of this happened fast enough, efficiently enough, that these technological marvels could be used freely, casually, in quantities that would have seemed fantastic to any military planner of the previous generation. A German artillery officer captured near Aachen in October 1944 had been shown a proximity-fused shell by his American interrogators. After examining it, he had reportedly said, "You have built a small radio station that fits inside a shell. We can barely build radio stations that fit inside a truck. How do you expect us to compete with this?" The interrogator's response had been telling in its casualness. "We don't expect you to compete, we expect you to surrender." This was the voice of a nation that had transformed its entire economy into a war machine without suffering privation at home, that could afford to put $25 fuses on $3 shells, that could treat advanced technology as expendable ammunition. The gulf was not merely quantitative, but philosophical. America waged war the way it built cars and appliances, with standardized parts, mass production, and the assumption that there would always be more where that came from. Germany had begun the war with superior tanks, superior aircraft, and superior doctrine. 6 years later, German superiority existed only in the memories of men like Reinhardt, who had known what excellence looked like before it was buried under the sheer weight of American abundance. By late January 1945, Reinhardt had been reassigned to a hastily reformed battery composed of survivors from 3 different destroyed units. They had 2 guns between them, one worn-out 105mm howitzer, with a barrel so eroded that its accuracy was questionable, and a captured Soviet 122mm piece that fired ammunition scavenged from battlefield salvage. They had fewer than 30 rounds total. Their fire direction center consisted of a sergeant with a school compass and outdated maps. They were, by any measure, a spent force. Yet they remained in position because there was nowhere else to go, no reserves to relieve them, no strategic withdrawal that might save them for future battles. The Wehrmacht in the west had become a brittle shell, still maintaining the appearance of an army while lacking the substance of one. On January 29th, Reinhardt's battery was ordered to provide fire support for a local counterattack, a battalion-sized assault meant to recapture a village that controlled a key road junction. It was a pointless objective in a pointless battle, but orders were orders, and German soldiers still followed orders. They fired their remaining shells in 2 brief fire missions, supporting the infantry assault with everything they had left. Through his optics, Reinhardt watched German soldiers advance across open ground toward American positions. For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, it seemed they might succeed. The leading elements reached the edge of the village. MG-42 fire echoed through the valley. This was what they had trained for, what they had once been good at. Then the American artillery replied. The barrage that fell on the attacking infantry was not merely overwhelming, it was annihilating. Proximity-fused shells created a ceiling of death above the battlefield, an invisible barrier that no assault could penetrate. The German infantry tried to press forward, tried to use their training and discipline to reach their objectives. But there was no training for this, no discipline that could protect you from explosions that materialized out of the air itself. The attack collapsed within minutes. Of the 600 men who had begun the assault, fewer than 200 made it back to the starting positions. The rest lay in the snow, torn apart by airbursts they had never seen coming. Reinhardt watched through his optics as American infantry casually advanced into positions that German soldiers had just died trying to capture. They moved without urgency, without fear, because they knew their artillery had cleared the way. They were men who fought under an umbrella of steel so complete that the enemy's best efforts couldn't touch them. That night, Reinhardt destroyed his gun's breech block with a sledgehammer and led his remaining crew westward. They were not deserting the front line, had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. They walked through a landscape of defeat, passing other scattered units, other survivors, all moving vaguely westward because there was nowhere else to go. On February 3rd, they encountered an American patrol near the Rhine. Reinhardt raised his hands. The Americans, young men who looked barely old enough to shave, accepted their surrender with casual efficiency. They were processed, searched, and loaded into trucks with dozens of other prisoners. As the truck drove toward the rear areas, Reinhardt looked back at the front he was leaving. Somewhere in the distance, American artillery was firing not in urgent barrages but in methodical, measured salvos. Each shell, he knew, carried within it a small miracle of engineering. Each one represented an industrial and scientific capability so far beyond Germany's remaining capacity that comparison was meaningless. He thought of the laughter, years ago, when they had first encountered American forces, the jokes about wealthy, undisciplined soldiers who relied on material superiority because they lacked martial virtue. That laughter seemed now like the sound of men whistling past their own graves. The proximity fuse entered historical record as a footnote in most accounts of the Second World War, a technical achievement noted briefly in discussions of artillery development, mentioned in passing when historians discuss the Battle of the Bulge. Yet for the men who experienced its effects on the receiving end, it represented something more profound than a mere technological advancement. It was the physical manifestation of a truth that many German soldiers had refused to accept until it literally exploded over their heads, that they were not fighting simply against numerically superior forces, but against a civilization organized around principles fundamentally different from their own. The German Reich had been built on hierarchies of excellence, superior breeding, superior culture, superior military tradition. It had gone to war confident that these qualitative advantages would overcome quantitative disadvantages. 6 years of warfare had systematically destroyed that confidence, but the proximity fuse delivered the final, irrefutable evidence. America did not need superior soldiers. It had adequate soldiers equipped with superior tools, produced in quantities that made waste not merely acceptable, but tactical doctrine. America did not value individual excellence over mass efficiency. It had built a system that transformed mass efficiency into excellence at scale. The proximity fuse was not merely a better artillery fuse, it was the product of a society that could mobilize universities, corporations, and government laboratories toward a single goal, that could invest enormous resources into solving a single technical problem, and that could then manufacture the solution so abundantly that each unit could be used once and discarded. This was not how European powers had traditionally waged war. This was something new. Industrial warfare, elevated to a science, abundance weaponized into doctrine. In prisoner of war camps across France and Germany, in the months after surrender, former Wehrmacht artillerymen would gather and discuss the proximity fuse in tones usually reserved for natural disasters or acts of God. They had been defeated by many things, by Soviet mass, by Allied air power, by strategic incompetence and criminal leadership, but the proximity fuse represented something unique. It was the weapon that had made their own expertise irrelevant, that had turned skilled veterans into helpless targets. "We spent years learning our trade," a former battery commander told a US Army historical officer during a post-war interview. "Years studying ballistics, angles, ranges. We could put a shell through a window at 3 kilometers, and then you arrived with your magical fuses, and none of our skill mattered anymore. You didn't need to be precise. You just needed to fire in our general direction, and your shells did the rest. We were craftsmen, competing against a factory. We never stood a chance." The officer conducting the interview noted that the German's tone carried no bitterness, only a kind of exhausted recognition, the voice of a man who had finally understood the rules of the game he had been playing. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of the war itself, told through the medium of a single technology. It exemplifies the gulf that existed not merely between armies, but between ways of organizing society for conflict. Nazi Germany had created a war machine built on plunder, slave labor, and the extraction of resources from conquered territories. It could produce wonders, but always in limited numbers, always constrained by the fundamentally extractive nature of its economy. The United States had created something different. A war economy that made civilian consumers into producers, that channeled prosperity into production, that could afford to spend $25 per shell because its industrial base generated wealth faster than the war consumed it. American workers building proximity fuses in factories across the country were earning good wages, buying war bonds, and looking forward to peacetime prosperity. German workers assembling V-2 rockets were slaves, dying by the thousands in underground factories, their labor extracted through violence and coercion. This difference between an economy of abundance and an economy of extraction manifested itself in every aspect of military capability. The proximity fuse was merely the most elegant example. In the mathematics of warfare, abundance has always mattered. But the Second World War represented the first conflict in which abundance could be translated into technological sophistication at scale. Previous wars had seen quantity oppose quality, masses oppose expertise. But here was a combatant that could produce both simultaneously, that could make excellence routine, sophistication, standard, and advanced technology as common as ammunition. The German artillerymen, who had laughed at American wastefulness, learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare, that in an industrial conflict between nations, the victory goes not to the most skilled but to the most productive, not to the most excellent but to the most capable of sustaining excellence at scale. They had been taught to value the individual master craftsman, the skilled veteran, the accumulated wisdom of military tradition. They encountered an enemy that had made craftsmen obsolete through standardization, that replaced veteran skill with technological systems, and that viewed military tradition as just another input to be optimized in the great industrial equation of total war. Decades later, researchers studying the development of the proximity fuse would trace its lineage back to 1940, to British scientists fleeing occupied Europe and American engineers working in university laboratories. They would document the thousands of small innovations that had to occur before the final product could work. Better vacuum tubes, more stable batteries, miniaturized circuitry, improved quality control. They would note that the fuse's development required coordination between the military, academia, and private industry on a scale never before attempted. But they would sometimes miss what men like Reinhardt understood instinctively in those frozen forests of Germany, that the proximity fuse was not merely a weapon, but a prophecy. It foretold a future in which wars would be won, not by the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the societies capable of mobilizing science, industry, and resources most effectively. It announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare in which technological sophistication would be deployed with the abundance previously reserved for bullets and boots. The German soldier of 1945 was not inferior to his counterpart of 1940. He was often better trained, more experienced, more aware of the realities of modern combat, but he fought with equipment his nation could barely produce, using ammunition that grew scarcer each day, against enemies who could afford to put laboratory-grade technology into every artillery shell. The laughter had died in the snow and mud of the Western Front, replaced by the sound of shells bursting overhead, shells that carried within them the entire industrial might of a continent that had never known invasion, never experienced strategic bombing of its factories, never had to choose between producing weapons or feeding its people. In that sound, the particular crack of an airburst detonating at precisely calculated altitude, the German artillerists heard the voice of their own obsolescence. They were men of the 19th century, practitioners of a craft perfected over decades, facing the 20th century's revelation that craft itself could be mass-produced, that excellence could be standardized, and that the advantage would always flow to those who could transform abundance into precision. The proximity fuse remained in service long after the war ended, evolving into more sophisticated forms, finding applications in air defense and anti-missile systems. The basic principle, a shell that knows when to explode based on sensor input, became foundational to modern guided munitions. The cruise missiles and smart bombs of later conflicts are the direct descendants of that first radio-equipped artillery shell, but its true legacy is not technological. It lies in the lesson it taught about the nature of modern conflict, that wars between industrial nations would be decided not on battlefields but in factories, not by generals but by engineers, not through the valor of individual soldiers, but through the systematic application of resources at scale. The German artillerymen who faced proximity-fused artillery learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible. They discovered that all their skill, all their training, all their professional pride meant nothing against an enemy who could afford to put advanced technology into disposable munitions. They found themselves on the wrong side of history's trajectory, representing a tradition of military excellence that was being swept away by the pure force of industrial modernity. And in their defeat, in the terrible clarity of those airbursts exploding overhead, in the mathematical certainty of their own obsolescence, they experienced what every future soldier would learn, that the wars of the 20th century and beyond would belong not to the most skilled warriors, but to the societies capable of transforming wealth into technology, technology into weapons, and weapons into such abundance that they could be used without thought of conservation. The laughter had ended, the shells had spoken, and in their voice was the sound of the future, automated, abundant, and utterly indifferent to the courage of the men it destroyed.